I'm Julie Bindel. I'm a feminist campaigner and a journalist, and I'm privileged to know Karen as a friend and as a feminist comrade, and we've worked together in countering male violence for a number of years, and I know that that's where both of our hearts are, in countering male violence. Karen, over to you.
Hi, I'm Karen Ingala Smith, and Julie, there is nobody I would prefer to chat to tonight because of your long history in this work, and I know you're coming from a similar place to me and have similar priorities about women and men's violence. So thank you very much for doing me this honour.
Well, and the honour's mine, and thank you for standing your ground as one of the very few feminists running services for women who've experienced all forms of horrendous male violence and keeping those services female only. And who would have thought that we would be having this conversation about a book that's just been written about protecting female-only spaces when this was done and dusted decades ago? And yeah. I want to ask you this question, Karen, to start off, and it's this. What would you say to a feminist who'd been doing the kind of work we'd been doing, but who's been in a coma for 10 years and she's just woken up? How would you explain to her how we've got here?
Oh, gosh. So I would say that, I would say that there developed a trend whereby people believed that they were the sex other than than they were, and that legislation was developed to protect this small minority of people, and it was coming from a good place, but that trend spread exponentially, and the legislation that was developed hadn't taken into account women's needs, and when feminists realised what was happening and started raising concerns about them, it became the feminist problem rather than the problem of society allowing males into women's space.
It's almost as if they didn't really care about male violence in the first place, and it's almost as if they resented us. And by they, I mean the trans activists, which include actually very few trans people, but misogynists of different stripes. It's almost as if they resented us having our own spaces and our own sex-based rights in law in the first place.
I think that's right. And I think you've got to remember that women weren't given sex-based rights, and we weren't given spaces for women who have been subjected to men's violence because men's violence existed. It was women, it was feminists, it was survivors who together grew those services. So you're absolutely right. Until women started doing something about it, men's violence went unchecked and accepted as normal.
Well, you go through this in your book, of course, because we don't just get your arguments based on empirical research, on practice, on your feminist theory, on all of this experience that you've had. But you also look at how it happened, and you look at how tenuous our rights are. And we've seen this, obviously, in the States with abortion rights. We've seen the way that we have an amnesty on rapists now, with less than 1% of convictions from reporting through to the end. So men have been given, on the one hand, they're being given the message that if you rape a woman, she's more likely to end up in prison than you are. And at the same time, they're stripping us of the only protective measures we have in order to deal with what's happened to us, stay safe from further violence, and to start on the road to recovery. So tell us a little bit about what you do in NIA and what led you to thinking that you had to put all of this down in a book.
So starting from NIA, we provide a range of services for women who've been victimised by men. We started as a refuge organisation years ago. We were Hackney Women's Aid. And now we run 3 specialist refuges for women who are escaping domestic and sexual violence and prostitution. It's really important to us that we don't say we're just domestic violence. And we specialise in women with problematic substance use. Basically, we work with the women that most refuges turn away from their services and say that their needs are too complex, that their lives are too chaotic, because we see that as an equal opportunities issue in one way, but in another, women who have problematic substances use and are living with multiple disadvantage are usually in that position because of a lifetime of abuse from men, starting with their father or father figure or other male family members, and being replaced by other men as they get older. So that's one sort of service that we run. We run a range of community-based services for women experience intimate partner violence, and we run East London Rape Crisis, which works with any woman, regardless of who perpetrated sexual violence upon her, regardless of when that occurred and whether or not she's taking action with the police. And we've always been a feminist organisation, and we were aware of the growing threat due to the possibility of self-identification. And myself, the senior management team and board of trustees were planning the next 5-year strategic plan, and we just got to the point where the board were about to ratify it. And I said, there's one thing that I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room. There's one thing that we haven't talked about, but I think it's a real threat. And I'd been a bit, I suppose before then, I'd had to be careful about what I said publicly, because when you're the chief exec of an organisation, although you've got the right to a private life, anything that you say can be related back to the organisation that you work for. So I'd been quiet publicly, and sort of the board we'd discussed that, but I said to the board, Nat, I think women's services are seriously under threat, and we should look at identifying a strategic aim being to protect women-only services. And the board of trustees all agreed with that. The senior management team, I knew, were behind that anyway, and we made that decision, and that's the way that we've decided to go.
How did you become so bigoted and hateful? Because I mean, I am as well, obviously. We were both seen to be so dangerous that Eventbrite,
yeah,
selling the tickets for this. I mean, let's just talk about that for a minute, because it's completely, isn't it? I mean, look,
yeah.
We work, right? We're on the left. We are defenders of human rights for all. We choose to do what's pretty hard work, which is challenging male violence, because that means half the planet are going to get offended and defensive. Yeah. And at least 75% of all women are going to get defensive and offended at the same time. So we do this stuff. It's pretty traumatic, isn't it? We see it happening to women. I make no assumptions about women that I work with, but, it's happened to me. I've experienced male violence. It's often what brings us to this fight. And yet we're hateful bigots. How did it happen that all of a sudden we became hateful bigots? Can somebody explain?
Oh gosh, can I explain? Well, I think men spotted a trick, didn't they? Another way to, a way to get at us. It is just another form of what about the men? Yet they've managed to wrap it up in progressive ribbons and present it as something that it's not. And the arguments we're hearing here are the same that you and I have heard as long as we've been involved in this work. And I think, I think there's that sort of be nice impulse in a lot of people, and I get where that's coming from. And I think it's good that we have learned to consider minority positions, or try to put ourselves in the shoes of people who have less choices than we have, less advantages in society. but that rationale has been pinned onto a group that it doesn't belong to, and it doesn't work. You know, it's women who are the oppressed group in the sex hierarchy.
Yeah, and actually this is same shit, different century, isn't it? Because people think this is about trans people. It's actually not. I mean, we can have our own views about whether the diagnosis of being born in the wrong body is bonkers and whether you should treat a psychological problem with surgery and hormones. We've all got our views about that. But this isn't about trans people at all. This is about the way that men that hate women, and unfortunately their defenders, other women, many women, hate the work that we're doing because it points a very, very uncomfortable finger at
absolutely
the man sitting across you at the breakfast table, the man that raised you that somebody says something about and you don't want to believe it. It's the man that you work with that does something that makes you feel uncomfortable and you can't bear to face it. We know that silence is a killer for women, and men know this, and they rely on this, don't they? And so
they do, and that's why we, even the term violence against women and girls, the acronym VOG, the statutory bodies and politicians, they forget to put the M in front of it.
And that's what's so great about the book, because you actually look at this in context. You look, for example, and one of the most useful chapters, I think, for me, because I've never worked in direct service provision, is how the need for women-only spaces help women not just stay safe, but help women understand and rationalise what happened to us. And it's only then that women can think about talking to other women about it. It's not your fault. And I mean, that's a cliche, but women still think it's our fault when things happen.
Absolutely. When I started working in refuges, it became very clear very quickly that most of the sort of work on women's head was done by the women themselves in the refuges in the evenings when the staff went home. And it's by listening to other women and telling other women that it's not their fault and what happened to them wasn't acceptable and is horrific, and that they were right to leave, that women can start to hear that message about themselves as well. You just cannot overstate the importance of that work that women often unconsciously do with each other. And I think being in a space that is women only, other than their children in many refuges, is a first for women then. And this is one of another important reasons for keeping it women only, that women are socialized to care for men and to put other people before them. And when they're in a space that they don't have to do that, it's just so freeing and liberating. And women speak about that all the time, not having to look after somebody other than themselves and their kids.
And yet people think that this is only an issue about direct danger. I don't mean only, but just an issue about direct danger. For example, a woman who encounters a male sexual predator in a changing room and he's masquerading as female, or of course women in prison with the likes of Karen White, where they're in direct and immediate danger. But this is also about something else, isn't it? And again, you really go through the detail of this in your book in a really accessible way, so that those that haven't ever done this work would instantly, in my view, get it. It's about how many women are deterred from accessing services if they know there's going to be blokes there, however the fuck they're identifying. And so we've heard about Sarah Summers, the woman who, she's got a crowd justice campaign going because she's suing Brighton Rape Crisis, refusing her female-only space and services when she presented as a survivor of rape. And there are lots of cases like that. But I just want to tell a little story about how I came into this debate and how I got first targeted as transphobic, as anti-trans bigot. And it was back in 2004 when I'd seen that Vancouver Rape Relief, which is a fantastic organisation. And those of you that don't know Vancouver Rape Relief, please look it up. It's, I suppose, I mean, Naya is like one of its kind of siblings, I suppose. It's
they were an inspiration, that's for sure.
Right, so it's holistic. It does policy campaigning. It does peer support. Lots of women who are survivors then grow through the collective and become recognised experts in their own field of countering male violence. They're wonderful, and I hadn't met them at this stage back in 2004, but I read something in a newsletter about how they had been put through 10 years of litigation. It actually ended up in the end as 20 years of litigation.
Yeah.
Imagine the 10 years of litigation by 2004 by a man who said he was trans, said he was female, who wanted to counsel rape victims, female rape victims. And I'm very specifically not using the term survivor here. I'm talking about women who presented victimized there and then, who were supposed to see this bloke, because we all know, and accept that whatever his kink was, that was, they were going to be the sacrificial lamb for it. And so I wrote a column in Guardian Weekend going bonkers about this. And that was the beginning of it for me. And, you know, obviously there's no going back, and nor do I regret it at all. But years later, when I was researching a book on the global sex trade and the horrors of that, and I know that you deal with that at NIA and as a campaigner, I visited Vancouver, Rape Relief, and I was taken around the downtown east side, which is one of the poorest areas. It's definitely in Canada, but probably across North America. And there are women in brothels that jump out of the window to escape their pimps. Horrific things in plain sight. And the woman, a young Indigenous woman, was taking me around. She was a survivor of prostitution. She pointed to a really nice building and said, that's the drop-in centre for young prostituted women who wish to access services or just have a break, just talk to other women, have a cup of tea. And I said, oh, wonderful. Can we go and visit? Could we go and talk to them? And she said, no, unfortunately not, because Vancouver has self-ID, so any man can decide that they're women and will get a certificate to prove that they are. Blokes just go in, she said, just actual blokes, like they're sitting at the table with their beards and their deep voices and their macho ways, because the homeless hostel for men down the road isn't as nice. Now that is the reason why we have to protect single-sex spaces. Imagine how many women wouldn't go to that drop-in that would otherwise...
or would go once and never go back. You know, and when something happens to a friend, as it invariably does, and especially with women in prostitution who make friends with other women, they're going to say, don't go there, it's not safe. In fact, in the UK, although I suppose I've read a lot of domestic homicide reviews, and another way that men find vulnerable women to latch onto is things like drug and alcohol support groups, and a lot of them are mixed, and so I think actually we need to look at extending our women-only services, and that, you know, drug and alcohol drop-ins should also be women-only.
Yeah, and it's not just male violence, is it? Because as a lesbian, this might surprise some of you on here, but I am a lesbian.
You never told me.
Just come out recently, but in the old days, when because obviously I'm very elderly now, I've just passed 60. Actually a lesbian when it wasn't allowed. Actually wasn't allowed.
I know. Terrible.
But we prevailed. And just thinking about how I was able to come out and grow from the shame, the self-hatred, the doubt, that you know, I believed the stuff that was being said to me. I was a freak, I was really a boy, I was a pervert. Having that space to talk to other women honestly and openly, probably saying, do you think I'm a freak? Are we weird? Is there something wrong with us? Being able to do that in a group of young women at the time was so important to me. And it was how I was able to actually reconcile what was going on and then become proud of it.
Yeah, I mean, that it also just shows how cruel it is that now young lesbians who are in the position that, you might have been in then have now been given another question, which is, are you actually a man born in a woman's body? And that, I guess, you know, the young women are clutching at that as an answer to explain feelings that they might not understand or might not welcome in themselves, and as a way out, you know, a way out of the awful sexualization that is thrust, you know, it's forced upon young women. You know, it was bad enough when we were young, but you know, people didn't hold a handheld computer in the hand and have access to the kind of pornography that young men and young women have access to today. You know, it was your brother's magazine and somebody opening the legs and you know, red scratchy fake lace knickers. You know, it's horrific. It's, you know, no wonder young women are opting out of that.
Yeah, and you say that in your book, that this isn't just, I mean, this is something beyond the immediate urgent issues and cases. Because if we allow people to think this is just about women in prison who may get raped, or women who have nowhere to go and therefore, you know, might take their own lives. Okay, they're the dramatic but all too prevalent examples.
Yeah.
And we'll let them get away with all the rest of the stuff. We'll let them get away with saying that we can't have our own bars, that we can't have our own social events, that we can't have our own clubs of any type, because of course the law wouldn't permit us to do that, that we'd have to admit trans women as they identify into our space. And, you know, it occurred to me that obviously, you know, this is global. And I was thinking that, you know, this is, because it's very much an issue to do with class and privilege. You do not get kids from families that are working class who are buying into all of this blue-fringed identitarian nonsense.
Not in the same numbers anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there will be some, but
yeah,
it's been pushed, it's been peddled by that.
Absolutely, it's going through the universities, isn't it?
We should talk about class and this, because obviously we said something very, very important. You know, before my time in the 60s and 70s, feminists that were doing the work to end male violence said, look, this cuts across every single culture, class, context, right? This is not a matter of working class men getting drunk and coming home and beating their wives because they're stressed and because their housing is terrible. But we said that, and it's true. It is 100% true. But we need to nuance it now, I think. I think what we need to remind people is, absolutely, that's the case. But who needs the services that are women only? Who's more likely to actually run away from home?
That's right.
It's working class women, isn't it?
Yeah, it's most of the women in the refuges are women with no other choices, nowhere else to go, because they're not about better roses to stay there. If you can afford to go somewhere else, if you've got an income, if you've got friends with big posh houses and spare bedrooms, I know that's quite rare in London now, but maybe, you know, it wasn't quite as rare in the past, then you will do that before you go to a refuge. The women, you know, the women in refuges are almost always there because they've got no other choice. And it's the same with women in prison. They don't have the choice of not being there. And it's these women with the fewest choices that are, I guess, getting the hardest edge of this ideology, the impacts on it. And it's not right. And it you know, those of us who do have the opportunity to speak out should be doing so. I'm really sick of hearing well-paid chief executives of women's organizations talk about it not being safe for them to speak out, because if it's not safe for you to speak, and you're, you know, what's that notion when you're supposed to be working with women who've been subjected to actual men's violence? If you're talking, you know, it's just an insult.
Well, we always knew that it was dangerous to speak out against male violence because we get massively punished for it. I don't know what's different, what's new.
I think that the sector has changed, though, hasn't it? I don't think it was seen as a cushy career path in the past, in the way that it's become now. You know, when I got my first job in a refuge in the early 90s, I don't remember the sector being flooded with marketing graduates and fundraising, this, that and the other, and anybody who worked in the national organisations had almost always sort of done an apprenticeship working in a small local organisations. So the way the sector's become professionalised, and I use that word in inverted commas, I think has been that to the detriment of the understanding of what the issues are.
For definite, I completely agree. And I suppose we're not being heard in the way that we should, because we're doing the work that the government should be doing. And obviously the government isn't going to do feminist work. We need to be the ones educating and pushing and campaigning and agitating. But obviously the government is not fulfilling its duty, never has under any government, but clearly worse under the Tories. But speaking of which, I mean, we're not listened to, and we're told, even though we actually developed the critique of trans ideology. We developed the critique of misogyny and how men use trans ideology in order to, you know, they call us cunts when they can't call us cunts, so they call us TERFs. So we actually presented that evidence and those arguments. And yet, how come the popular notion is that the only pushback against trans ideology is from right-wing bigots that hate queers? We are the ones that set the agenda on this, and then the interlopers came in my view, and decided that they would use it to be bigoted against all of those of us that are different or that are agitating in a way that they don't like.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree with you, Julie. You can very clearly see that happening. And I just think it's important that those of us with a broader understanding of inequality just don't lose that. And remember, we will still be here doing the feminist work when they've got bored and moved on to their next big cause. But it is worrying, and I suppose you can see a split happening now, and I think it's really important that split happens, because if your feminism doesn't take account of poverty, of social class, economic class, and race inequalities, then you're not. To me, that's not feminism.
Absolutely right. And speaking of feminism, one of the things I loved about your book is that you define feminism for you. And I think that we've got a duty and an imperative to do that. I mean, it doesn't mean we think that everybody has to agree, although, we've often said in our humorous moments, haven't we, there are hundreds of ways to be a feminist, but most of them are wrong, right? But it has to mean something, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
You say actually that there's revolutionary or there's reformist. Okay, which one are you?
Oh, I'm both, and I think most feminists are a mixture of both. And the reforms can be really frustrating, and they can be slow, and sometimes I think they can be a distraction from the real job, because you're winning. It's being grateful for chip scraps when you wanted a piece of fish. It's a distraction. But if we wait for the feminist revolution, then we're going to be letting a lot of atrocities continue to happen and stopping a lot of progress. So I think we've got to keep our eye on the prize. I think we've got to be working towards big social change, but at the same time, we can't allow injustice to go unchallenged. So you've got to be chipping away at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the more revolutionary we can be when it's appropriate and when we've had enough, the more, I suppose, it sets a bar for those that are working alongside us, either within a paid role or activism, and obviously many of us do both. But how do we bring women along with us when there's so much hostility to the views that we have about male violence and about the need for women-only spaces? Because on the one hand, what I'm seeing is a resurgence of feminism where new women, young women, and mainly young women, are coming in and saying, right, as you've just explained, Karen, our lives are shit with the proliferation of porn, with the sexual bullying that we're facing from school onwards, and all this reframing of what's positive and empowering. Of course, the word empowering is never used for men, is it? Ever?
No.
Everything that's bad for women is empowering, stripping and sex work, as they say. And so they're into feminism in droves, and they're brilliant, and they're so enthusiastic, as we saw at the Philia conference, 1,800 women.
Yeah.
Brilliant. But then on the other hand, and this is what surprised me when I was researching, when I was writing my last book on feminism, was how actually it's young women, mainly queer identified, whatever that means, that are the foot soldiers for the misogynists. They are way more active in punishing other women on this issue than the men. The men are sitting back and just doing their Billy Bragg, Owen Jones moment. But it's full of women who obviously have seen what happens to those of us that speak out and are trying to appease. They don't want to be disliked. What the hell do we do to get through to those women?
It's really difficult as well, isn't it? Because you know, when you're emerging into young womanhood, you know, you are experiencing your sexuality for the first time. You're starting to enjoy your body in a way that you didn't before, and you know, I can understand getting pulled along by that, and you know. I don't know if you remember being little, but you know, wanting so desperately to be a grown up, and to embrace what that offered, and where I guess we're sold that they're sold the lie that that this version of womanhood is going to be the thing that sets them free, and you know, I don't think there's enough opportunity to teach young people social criticism or critical thinking. You know, I never did sociology at school. Now that's a long time ago, but I think, you know, that way of analysing and critiquing isn't usually offered. And another thing that NIA does is we run some young women's services. So we have young feminists who work with other young feminists and teach them concepts like patriarchy and concepts like misogyny and victim blaming, and when young women are talked through these sort of concepts, then they can see it, but that doesn't happen enough.
And I completely agree. And what I really appreciated with your book was the fact that you set out the way that we can move forward. It's not a doom and gloom text at all, far from it. It's a rally cry, isn't it? And it's a how-to book as well. So you've got, for example, a chapter on the fight to preserve single-sex services. Yeah. You know, people say often, and they mean well, you know, and you know, feminism's a very optimistic movement, but sometimes you get optimistic, don't you? But some people say, look, the fight is lost. We just have to wait for the next generation. No. You've got saying the fight to preserve single-sex spaces. So I'd love for you to talk to us about that fight and how we do it and how we win.
Okay. I think those of us that are involved in working in services need to understand why it is that women need single-sex services. And the things that unfortunately, the things that I hear from many so-called professionals is that they don't understand that need themselves. So I would say read that chapter of my book that explains why that's necessary. And then we've got to reconnect to that revolutionary spirit of our four sisters. So commissioners say that we must provide mixed services. We've got to reject that. We've got to resist, and we've got to not be afraid of the consequences. Now, I know those consequences are really bad. I have seen services lose contracts because there was a pressure to become admit males. But if not us, then who, basically?
Yeah, and I mean, people often say, don't they, well, I can't, I'll lose my job, and I can't because I've got to feed my kids. And, you know, there are many cases where we know that the consequences would be far worse for some women than others, which we have a responsibility to stand in front of those for whom it would be dire, but we have to do it.
We do, but I don't understand why, you know, so far down the line. So yes, you know, as far as I know, NIA was the first UK organisation to publicly say that we're going to apply the provisions of the Equality Act and stay single sex, and then we were followed by Aurora New Dawn in Portsmouth. As far as I know, nobody else has, and I don't understand why. You know, I knew that we were the first, but I did expect other organisations to follow and start speaking up. And don't get me wrong, there are quite a lot of women's organisations who have said to me quietly and you know, oh yes, that's what we do in practice, but you've got to understand our commissioners make it difficult, and we can't, it's too risky for us to say anything, and it's not really a problem in our area, so why should we say anything? But in a way, if it's not a problem in your area, then get in first and get those provisions laid out, convince people. But you know, we see the nonsense coming out of politicians' mouths that those that haven't thought through the consequences for women are far too quick to give these spaces away. And it's not necessarily out of malice, it's out of lack of thought, but also a desire, as I said earlier, a desire to do right by people who they perceive as being disadvantaged.
Or the fear of not being liked, I think, is huge. I think it's one of the most difficult things for us to unlearn, and I speak very personally on this as well, and also from experience of others. But we've got lots of questions in, and we've only got till 8 o'clock, so
let's have a look at some.
They're all brilliant, actually. I have to say, the quality of these questions are spot on, as you can expect from Women's Place UK audience. And I like this one.
Go on.
Who do you hope most gets a copy of Defending Women's Spaces?
Oh gosh, I'd like people who are asking the questions and haven't yet got to an answer in themselves to read it. The ones that can think, I feel in myself that there's something right here, that women's spaces are important, but I'm not able to articulate why. They're the ones that I want to equip with the answers. I don't think people who take a different perspective are going to be changed by reading the book, and I don't think they'll bother reading the book. They'll probably leave their reviews about what they think it says, so it's not. My book isn't written for them. It's mainly written for women on the fence.
Yeah, well, and they're the ones that we need to convince, all the middle ground, which is the majority of society is in that middle ground. And obviously the Liberals have always been difficult because they always go to the side that they think are the poor oppressed, and they start to believe the nonsense about who has the power and who doesn't. But I completely see your point. I suppose this question follows on from that, which is, how do we make the opposition party see the error of their ways?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because if the opposition party can chuck you out for having these thoughts, they will do that. And if they can keep you out of their party, they will do that. And that's really, really worrying, because I think Labour membership staff are basically gatekeeping the political party. And so policy is being set away from where policy should be set. It's been set at the gate, if you know what I mean. So as you know, I've not been allowed to rejoin the Labour Party, so women like me are being prevented from having a say in shaping policies, which is really worrying. And I can't remember what your question was.
Just that, really, about
okay.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered it. I think, you know, how we convince those in opposition to us is really what you were saying earlier about, if those that are absolutely entrenched within their views on this are closed-minded anyway.
Yeah.
You'd have to be closed-minded, because otherwise you wouldn't believe the fairy tale. Flat Earth.
Yeah.
Every bit of evidence shows them that they are wrong. So they can't. I mean, actually, that reminds me of a time that I was doing Woman's Hour, and I was debating with someone who just wasn't that good on this issue at all.
Right.
She's posing as a rabid trans activist, but probably for financial reasons. And I felt quite cruel. I wiped the floor with her, really. It was very easy. And, you know, I was courteous in doing it, but it was so clear that I'd smashed it. Came out, and there were these two women in their late 20s waiting to go on to do some other item, not related to the gender wars. And they said, "Oh, that was really interesting." And I said, "Oh, yeah, thank you. Who did you agree with? I thought it was a done deal." "Oh, well, obviously we agreed with the other one because," and I said, "Really?" And they said, yeah, that's what people our age think. She actually just told me that there was no thinking involved at all.
Yeah.
It's orthodoxy.
You know, the mantra trans women are women, I mean, the answer is actually no, they're not. And, you know, tell me how they're women. Nobody can answer that in a way that makes any sense. And I think that, you know, one of the good things about Kath Stock's book is that she works through that question from a lot of different answers. And, you know, nobody's managed to find a way to come back and answer that question in a way that disproves what she's had to say.
Yeah, and as Kath said, it's fiction. You go along with fiction.
Yeah. When I heard her speak the first time, and she introduced that concept of legal fiction, it made something click in my head. It was you know, very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't read Kathleen Stock's book, Material Girls, do, but read Karen's first, right?
Read mine first, because think about women before you think about trans people.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. And here's someone's asking for your advice. There's lots and lots of questions asking for your advice, and I think you give lots of advice in your book, actually. But what advice can you offer to those of us trying to negotiate with misogynistic slurs, silencing and smearing from men on the left? Because both you and I are on the left, aren't we? And we refuse to actually give up that ground to that lot. What would you say?
I think don't concede ground. Don't let them silence you. If they try to silence you, find another place to speak. But also, you know, sometimes just don't waste your time. Don't give those idiots your precious energy. Take your time and energy, your thoughts, to somewhere where they'll be useful.
Absolutely. Well, there's another question here that I really want to read out, but I'm going to have to truncate it because it's quite long.
Okay.
So the person asking the question, the woman asking the question, works in an organisation that's very taken with gender ideology, and they frame it as the open and fairness, kindness thing.
Okay.
But obviously, this person works in social care and is supposed to, is tasked with supporting women escaping male violence. And she's actually a survivor of domestic violence herself. So in that situation, which is actually not dissimilar to Naya in a way, even though it's obviously social services and that being a agency. How can she actually speak up without being shut down or being deemed to be transphobic, which then actually just completely closes off all conversation, doesn't it?
I think she's just to focus on the client when she's with the client, and put her interests first, and find a way of making the argument without revealing the argument. You know, ask questions, pull apart the logic rather than immediately open it, and ask about safeguarding.
Because, as you say, you know, this is about women and this is about male violence. And what's really important, as another person who's put a question here, is, you know, how did trans women take centre stage when it comes to the idea that they face the most violence and are at the most risk of violence, when there's nothing statistical to support this notion? And obviously, you know, we know it's about men convincing us that they're the eternal victims, and that and actually they've done this before, haven't they? In the 1980s, men's rights activists that, you know, before they invented the whole trans ideology nonsense, were just saying that they were the most likely victims of domestic violence.
Oh sure, the women are as bad as men, and men can be victims too, don't you know? And of course they can, but in much smaller numbers. And
sorry,
you know, and you know, they're less likely to be seriously harmed by women. And if a woman kills a male partner, it's usually a male partner who's being abusing her, rather than the other way around. If a man kills a woman, he's usually been abusing the woman for months. But they try every which way to deny what is done to women in our society.
Yes, and actually, it's, as we said, you know, different tactics.
It is, yeah.
I remember being really startled at a conference on domestic violence back in the late 80s, and some men's rights activist who'd been given a little bit of credibility. It was around that time government ministers were starting to listen to them, thinking they better had, because we were horrible women and we weren't allowing them to speak about their victimhood. And this bloke stood up and said, it's in the government's own statistics. You know, men are almost as likely to be victims of female domestic abuse as they are. And I went and had a look at that.
Yeah.
And it was obviously because what they'd done is, just like the trans activists now, they'd actually reframed the definition of domestic. They'd added nagging. They didn't call it nagging, but it was whatever, verbal violence. And that somebody asked him to take the bins out, and that was domestic abuse all of a sudden. So they reframed it, just like the trans activists have now. And actually, this is just about male violence. And as one participant says here, we are concerned about trans-identified men in women's spaces because they are male, not trans.
Exactly, and I think I make that point in my book several times, you know, where I don't think there's anything in any process of transitioning that takes away the sex differences between women and men.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, you know, you and I both came to this debate. We didn't start this war. We certainly didn't want it. We've got too much else to do. But we came to it only because of male violence, didn't we?
Absolutely.
And this is something that I spend a lot of my time, if ever I talk about this to anyone that I don't know very well, spend most of my time saying that I actually really don't care how men dress, what they call themselves. I care about our sex-based rights, and I care about male violence and stopping male violence. So
absolutely, and I think we're forgetting as well, you know, it was a feminist idea that gender, so-called, should not be connected to sex, that we should break down those stereotypes. And I don't understand how that has become bigoted, and it's now progressive to say that you need to alter your body to fit what you want to wear or want to do, rather than regardless of your body, you should wear what you like and do what you like.
Yeah, exactly. And anyone that's ever been to any lesbian and gay discos in the 1970s, come and talk to me about gender nonconformity, right? This is a ridiculous notion that there's such a thing as non-binary, which
Yeah,
means what? And what does gender nonconformity means? Because to be a feminist, and to be a lesbian, of course, but just to be a feminist means you are not conforming to gender,
yeah,
because what gender means is sex stereotypes, doesn't it?
exactly, exactly. And I what what is so difficult to grasp about that, and what why does that have to be rallied against?
Tell me about what you think the effect of this deluge of gender ideology will be on girls and boys growing up, and how that might actually shape their views on male violence, on issues of what we used to be able to call gender-based violence without it being subverted to something else.
Well, I think young people get gender thrown on them in a much harder way than we did with when we were kids. You only have to look at toy aisles or supermarket clothing aisles, and the way that masculinity and femininity is much more strict. Children are much more strictly shoehorned into those boxes, and I suppose that, again, you can understand why some kids would react against that in a way that we didn't have to, because it wasn't quite so prevalent. But in terms of what the effect will be, I mean, I hope there's going to be a backlash, that the children of the blue fringes are going to grow up and just say, no, I'm not going to have my breasts removed in order to be able to say that I like climbing trees and going fishing and want to be a scientist. I can do that with the body that I have. I just hope that there's going to be that generational conflict that means that children will, the next generation will grow up and challenge this. But that, the worry is that there's this big generation that are doing the growing up now, that are being and I suppose I'm talking about the young people who've been captured to such an extent that they're on a transition pathway, that what's being done to their bodies now is irreversible, and they're going to have to live with that for the rest of their lives, and that's very worrying. I think a lot of those cheering them on aren't, they won't have, maybe some who are from a more privileged background, who currently see themselves as allies, are actually the enablers, but they're going to be able to walk away scot-free.
And of course, sex stereotypes matter, because it's not an irrelevancy when you're fighting male violence, as many of us are, many of us on this Zoom, many of us in the world that we work with. It can feel like a life and death situation, because often it is, as your work counting dead women and the Femicide Census tells us. But it is actually as urgent to tackle sex stereotypes, because without it, we wouldn't have male violence, would we? If we didn't have oppression, institutionalized oppression of women and girls, which is facilitated through us thinking that we have to be feminine and sexually submissive.
Absolutely.
Then we wouldn't actually have male violence. So it really matters as much, doesn't it? And you address this in your book again. You actually talk about the way that we're socialized. And although we can laugh about gender roles, and you and I have laughed about, when you were wearing dungarees one day when you came to visit me, and I was saying, who do you think you are, appropriating lesbian culture? We laugh at it, but it's deadly serious when it gets to what's being imposed upon girls, isn't it, and boys?
It is. And in my next book, which is not yet written, I'm basing that on my work on femicide, and I talk about actually what we need to do to end men's violence against women and girls, because the levels that we've to address it as society are much more complicated and much more ambitious than any government strategy so far has ever been.
Well, and your work has been so important, and there's lots of really nice comments about saying, yeah, there's another book, great. I mean, give her a break, people. You know, she's exhausted. So look, we've got 4 minutes left, okay. And
so one thing we have to do as good trustees of the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize is remind you that, what's the date, Julie, of the next prize giving event?
The prize is Friday the 2nd of December. It will be awarded at a great social event with food and booze and Nahanda, our great Nahanda, who's going to be performing, and we're going to have a film about the women's pushback in Iran. We're going to have the greatest night ever. Karen and I are both trustees, as she said, of the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize. And buy your tickets. We want to see
tickets. Yeah, come out for feminist drinking.
Go and get an autograph from Karen. Bring a copy of
Julie, bring your copies of our books. We'll sign them.
Get your book in time for Karen to sign it at that event. Because she'll have had a couple of drinks, right? Here's how it's going to work. Yeah. She'll be relaxed.
I've always loved you.
She will. It'll all be that will be going on. And she'll just agree to anything.
Yeah.
So bring your book. Remember, Nahanda, who is a fantastic performer. She was, for those of you that were at Philia, she performed during the session that I was chairing on the Sunday morning in front of a huge auditorium, and she was superb. So we're so thrilled to have her. Karen, we've got a couple of minutes. I want to hear what publicity you've done, what's in the pipeline, what's going to go on in terms of you really pushing this book to where it needs to be.
Okay, so this afternoon, I recorded a podcast with Rachel Johnson for Difficult Women. I think that I'm just recovering from a cold, unfortunately. That's going to be either next Monday or the Monday after. And I was privileged to be interviewed by Janice Turner for the Times, and I think that might be in the magazine this Saturday or the Saturday after that. And other than that, that's it really so far.
There'll be more for sure. And this is a book that is going to have a long shelf life, because
I hope so.
You know, it's going to go on. I think that most of us here will agree. We are really getting somewhere, and the tide has turned. We're being listened to, we're being heard. Books like this will make all the difference.
And we're able to speak plainly. You know, I think those who are new to this issue don't realize how unsayable a lot of things that we say now are. So when I gave evidence in Parliament at the Women and Equalities Committee, and I refused to say trans women, and I said trans identifying males. That was actually, I think, the first time most of those MPs who were asking me those questions had heard that then, and yet now that is a common way of addressing men with transgender identities. Now, I'm not saying that I'm the only one that did that, but I'm saying that a lot of us who have been speaking out on this issue have laid the groundwork, and that's, you know, not just me and Julie. There are a lot of women who have been doing this, and what is sayable now wasn't sayable 5 years ago.
Which is a wonderful point to end on. Thank you for all you do, Karen. You're
and yourself.
Everybody on this Zoom. God, I hate Zoom. Everyone who's been listening and watching. Lots of love and sisterhood to you all. And
thank you.
We shall see you at the Emma Prize, and we'll see you around. And thank you to Women's Place UK. They're brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, can I add to that, the sisterhood that I've had from the women at Women's Place, and the way that we all support each other, but that they've all supported me, has been second to none. And you know, I guess they have given me a foundation as in a way that women who worked in the men's violence against women sector didn't do.
Yeah, and I have so much respect for Women's Place UK, and I want to personally thank you too. And on that note, Karen, have a really big drink. Massive
I
drink.
will. You too. Good night.